The silence was deafening. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez pressed her back against the cold rock face and listened to her heart hammering against her ribs. 12 hours ago, she had been a communications specialist attached to SEAL Team 6. Now, with enemy fighters closing in from 3 directions and her team's leader bleeding out beside her, she was about to become something she never imagined possible. The radio crackled once, then died. Their lifeline to the outside world had been severed. 8 of America's most elite warriors were trapped in a kill zone, outnumbered 5 to 1, with no way to call for backup. The Taliban had learned from years of fighting American special forces. They had adapted, evolved, and now they had done the impossible. They had cornered the uncatchable. But what the enemy didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez carried more than just communication equipment on her back. She carried the memories of a childhood spent hunting with her grandfather in the Colorado Rockies, the tactical knowledge from 3 tours of duty, and something far more dangerous than any weapon in their arsenal, the unbreakable will of someone who had already survived the impossible once before. As the sound of boots on gravel echoed from the valley below, Maria made a decision that would either save her team or get them all killed. She was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely person in the room is exactly who you need when everything goes wrong. The morning started like any other in the Kunar province of Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her headset and ran through her equipment checklist one final time. Radio check, satellite phone, emergency beacon, backup batteries, everything was green. As the communications specialist for this mission, she was the team's lifeline to the outside world. Her job was to stay back, stay safe, and keep the lines open while the operators did what they did best. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison gathered his 7-man SEAL team around a hand-drawn map spread across a flat rock. The intelligence was solid. A high-value Taliban commander was holed up in a compound 3 clicks northwest of their position. It should have been a routine capture mission. Get in, grab the target, get out. Maria would establish a communications post on the ridge line and provide overwatch while the team moved down into the valley. The sun was just beginning to peek over the mountains when they started moving. Maria found her position on the rocky outcrop exactly where Morrison had indicated on the map. She had a clear view of the valley below and good line of sight for satellite communications. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, she would realize later. She watched through her binoculars as the team moved like ghosts through the morning mist. These men were the best of the best. Each one had survived years of the most intensive training the military had to offer. They moved as one unit, anticipating each other's movements without a word. Petty Officer First Class Tommy Chin took point, his rifle sweeping methodically from left to right. Behind him, Morrison moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had led dozens of successful missions. The others followed in perfect formation: Rodriguez, Williams, Jackson, Martinez, and, bringing up the rear, the team medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Kim. Maria had worked with SEAL teams for 2 years, but she never got tired of watching them operate. They were poetry in motion, deadly and graceful at the same time. She keyed her radio and whispered into her headset. "Base, this is Overwatch. Package is moving to target. ETA 15 minutes. The voice that came back was crisp and professional. "Copy, Overwatch. We have you loud and clear. Weather looks good for the next 6 hours. No enemy movement detected in your area." Maria allowed herself a small smile. Just another day at the office. She settled in behind her radio equipment and continued to watch the team's progress through her binoculars. The compound was a typical Afghan structure: mud brick walls, flat roof, small windows. According to intelligence, their target was inside with maybe 3 or 4 bodyguards. Nothing the team couldn't handle with their eyes closed. That's when she noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A flash of light from a ridge on the opposite side of the valley. Just a brief glint, like sunlight reflecting off glass or metal. Maria adjusted her binoculars and scanned the area carefully. There, another flash, this time from a different position. Her stomach began to tighten. She keyed her radio. "Actual, this is Overwatch. I've got possible movement on Ridge Charlie. Might be nothing, but I'm seeing light reflection at multiple positions." Morrison's voice came back immediately. Copy, Overwatch. Can you get a count? Maria swept her binoculars across the ridge line again. This time she saw what she was looking for. The faint outline of a man's head behind a rock, barely visible, but definitely there. Then, another, about 50 meters to the right. Her blood went cold as she realized what she was looking at. I count at least 6 positions on Ridge Charlie. This isn't random. They're in Overwatch positions covering the compound. Her voice remained steady, but inside, alarm bells were screaming. There was a long pause before Morrison responded. Overwatch, we're 2 minutes from target. Are you certain about those positions? Maria looked again, and this time she saw movement that left no doubt. Men were repositioning themselves along the ridge, setting up what looked like a coordinated ambush. I am certain. You need to abort. This is a trap. But, even as she said the words, Maria realized it was too late. The distinctive crack of an AK-47 echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the chatter of automatic weapons fire from multiple positions. The team had walked into a carefully planned ambush, and now they were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Maria grabbed her rifle and tried to get a clear shot at the ambush positions, but the range was too great for accurate fire. All she could do was watch helplessly as tracer rounds crisscrossed the valley floor like deadly fireworks. Through her binoculars, she could see the team members diving for whatever cover they could find behind rocks and small bushes. Overwatch, we're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Morrison's voice was calm, but urgent. I need immediate support and extract. Maria was already working her radio, switching to the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, this is Overwatch 6. We have troops in contact, require immediate air support, and medical evacuation. Grid coordinates follow. She rattled off the position data while keeping her eyes on the unfolding disaster below. The response was not what she wanted to hear. Overwatch 6, this is base. We copy your Mayday. Nearest air support is 30 minutes out. Weather is deteriorating rapidly. We may not be able to get birds in the air. 30 minutes. The team would be dead in 5 if something didn't change immediately. Maria watched in horror as more enemy positions revealed themselves. What had looked like a simple compound raid was turning into a major engagement. Intelligence had been wrong about everything. The number of enemies, their positions, their level of preparation. This wasn't just a few bodyguards protecting a Taliban commander. This was a full company of fighters who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Through her binoculars, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 20 different positions now. The enemy had the high ground, superior numbers, and prepared positions. The SEAL team was trapped in a kill zone with minimal cover and no way out. It was every special operations soldier's worst nightmare. Overwatch, we've got wounded. The voice belonged to Kim, the team medic. Morrison is down. I need covering fire to get to him. Maria felt her training kick in. She might be just a communications specialist, but she was still a soldier. She sighted her rifle on the nearest enemy position and began laying down suppressing fire. Her shots were accurate despite the range, forcing the enemy fighters to keep their heads down long enough for Kim to drag Morrison behind a larger rock. But even as she fired, Maria could see the situation deteriorating. More enemy fighters were appearing from positions that hadn't been there an hour ago. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a carefully orchestrated trap, and her team had walked right into it. Worse, she could see fighters moving to flank the team's position from both sides of the valley. In a matter of minutes, they would be completely surrounded with no avenue of escape. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate situation reports from the team below. Williams was low on ammunition. Chen had taken shrapnel in the leg. Jackson was trying to find a way out of the kill zone, but every route was covered by enemy fire. And Morrison, their leader and the man who had successfully led them through dozens of missions, was unconscious and losing blood fast. Maria made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She grabbed her pack and started moving down the ridge toward the valley floor. She was abandoning her primary position and her radio equipment, but staying put meant watching her teammates die one by one. At least moving gave her a chance to help, even if it meant walking into the same trap that had caught them. As she picked her way down the rocky slope, automatic weapons fire continued to echo off the valley walls. The sound was deafening, punctuated by the occasional explosion of a rocket-propelled grenade. The enemy wasn't just trying to pin down the SEAL team. They were trying to eliminate them completely. This was an execution, not a firefight. Halfway down the slope, Maria's worst fears were confirmed. She could see enemy fighters moving along the ridge lines on both sides of the valley, working their way around to cut off any possible escape route. Within minutes, 8 of America's most elite warriors would be completely surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces with no hope of rescue. That's when she realized that everything she thought she knew about this mission, about this war, and about herself was about to change forever. The woman who had started the day as a communications specialist was about to become something else entirely. The only question was whether any of them would live long enough for it to matter. Maria reached the valley floor just as the enemy completed their encirclement. The sound of boots on gravel echoed from 3 different directions now, closing in like the jaws of a steel trap. She pressed herself against a boulder and tried to control her breathing. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, she could hear Chin calling out grid coordinates for an airstrike that wasn't coming. She low-crawled the final 50 meters to where the team had taken cover behind a cluster of rocks. What she found there made her stomach turn. Morrison was pale and unconscious, a growing pool of blood soaking into the rocky ground beneath him. Kim was working frantically to stop the bleeding, but even Maria could see it was bad. Really bad. Chun looked up as she slithered into their makeshift defensive position. His face was streaked with dirt and blood from a grazing wound on his forehead. Rodriguez, what the hell are you doing down here? You're supposed to be maintaining communications. Communications are down anyway, Maria replied, checking her rifle. Radio took shrapnel. We're on our own. It wasn't entirely true. Her main radio was damaged but not destroyed. But she couldn't explain the real reason she had abandoned her post. How could she tell these men that she couldn't just sit on that ridge and watch them die? William's army crawled over from his position behind another rock. Situation's getting worse by the minute. I count at least 40 fighters now, maybe more. They've got us boxed in from 3 sides, and they're moving to close the 4th. He pointed toward the mouth of the valley. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this becomes a complete kill box. Jackson was monitoring their radio frequency, hoping for some miracle word from headquarters. Still no word on air support. Weather's gotten worse. They can't get choppers through the mountains, and the cloud ceiling is too low for close air support. He looked at the gray sky above them, heavy with the promise of snow. We're stuck here until this front passes. Maria assessed their situation with the cold clarity that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. 8 soldiers, 5 of them still combat effective. Morrison down and possibly dying. Limited ammunition and no way to resupply. Enemy forces with superior numbers, better positions, and home field advantage. No air support, no reinforcements, and no realistic hope of extraction until the weather cleared. By any rational military assessment, they were already dead. How much ammunition do we have left? She asked. The answers came back quickly and weren't encouraging. Chen had 2 magazines left. Williams was down to his last 30 rounds. Jackson had 4 magazines, but his weapon had been jamming intermittently since the firefight started. Martinez reported similar numbers. Even if they made every shot count, they had maybe 20 minutes of sustained fighting before they were reduced to throwing rocks. Through the constant chatter of enemy automatic weapons, Maria could hear something else that made her blood run cold. Voices calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their movements. These weren't just random Taliban fighters who had stumbled onto an opportunity. This was a well-trained unit executing a practiced maneuver. They had done this before. Kim looked up from Morrison's still form, his hands covered in blood. He's going into shock. I can slow the bleeding, but he needs real medical attention soon or he's not going to make it. The young medic's voice was steady, but Maria could see the fear in his eyes. They all knew what happened to wounded American soldiers who fell into Taliban hands. A new sound cut through the firefight, the distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds. Incoming, Chen shouted, and everyone pressed themselves as flat as possible against the rocks. The explosions walked across their position, each one closer than the last. Shrapnel pinged off the stones around them, and the smell of cordite filled the air. When the barrage stopped, Martinez was bleeding from a new wound on his arm. Their defensive position had been cut in half. Several of the larger rocks that had provided cover were now cracked and unstable. Worse, the mortar fire had been ranging shots, adjusting for accuracy. The next barrage would be right on target. "We can't stay here," Williams said, stating the obvious. "They've got our range now. Next time they'll drop those rounds right in our laps." But moving meant exposing themselves to the machine gun positions that had them pinned down. It was a classic military dilemma: stay and die slowly, or move and die quickly. Maria found herself thinking about her grandfather's hunting stories, about how the smartest prey animals survived by doing the unexpected thing, the thing that predators couldn't anticipate. She studied the terrain around them with new eyes. The valley floor was mostly open ground with scattered rocks and small depressions. Not much cover for a fighting withdrawal. But there was something else, something she had noticed during her descent from the ridge, but hadn't really processed. A small wadi, a dry stream bed, cut across the valley floor about 200 meters from their position. It was shallow, maybe 4 feet deep at most, but it ran perpendicular to the main axis of enemy fire. More importantly, it ran toward the one direction the enemy hadn't completely sealed off yet, a narrow gap between two ridgelines at the far end of the valley. If they could reach that wadi and use it for concealment, they might be able to break out of the encirclement before it was complete. "There," she said, pointing toward the stream bed. "If we can reach that wadi, we can move along it toward the gap in the ridgeline. It's not much cover, but it's better than staying here and getting pounded by mortars." Chen shook his head. "That's 200 meters of open ground. We'll be cut to pieces before we make it halfway." "Not if we do it right," Maria replied. She was thinking furiously, pieces of a plan forming in her mind. It was crazy, probably suicidal, but it was better than waiting here to die. We need a distraction, something to draw their fire away from that gap long enough for the team to move. Williams caught on immediately. "You're talking about a diversionary attack. Someone draws their attention while the rest of the team moves to the wadi." He paused, understanding the implications. "That's a suicide mission." "Not necessarily," Maria said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "If it's done right, timed perfectly, the person creating the diversion might be able to break contact and follow the team." She looked around at the faces of the men she had served with for 2 years. "But we need to move now, before they finish positioning their mortars for a sustained barrage." Kim was still working on Morrison, but he looked up long enough to voice what they were all thinking. "Who's going to make the diversionary attack? Whoever does it will be facing 40-plus enemy fighters alone." The question hung in the air like smoke from the battlefield. Everyone knew what it meant. Someone was going to have to sacrifice themselves so the others could escape. Someone was going to have to draw the fire of an entire company of enemy fighters and hold their attention long enough for 7 wounded and exhausted SEALs to cross 200 meters of open ground. Maria felt a strange calm settle over her as she realized what she had to do. These men had families, children, wives waiting for them back home. They were operators, the tip of the spear, irreplaceable assets in a war that was far from over. She was a communications specialist from small-town Colorado whose biggest claim to fame was keeping radio equipment working in the mountains of Afghanistan. The mathematics of it were brutally simple. If someone had to die so the others could live, it should be her. But before she could voice her decision, the sound of incoming mortars filled the air again. This time there was no warning, no time to take cover. The explosions were right on target, deafening and devastating. When the smoke cleared, Maria found herself partially buried under loose rock, her ears ringing so loudly she couldn't hear anything else. She pulled herself free and looked around at what remained of their position. Jackson was unconscious, an ugly gash across his forehead. Martinez was on his hands and knees, shaking his head to clear it. Williams was trying to reload his weapon with hands that shook from concussion. Worst of all, Kim was slumped over Morrison's still form, blood streaming from a shrapnel wound in his back. The medic who had been trying to save their leader was now wounded himself, possibly seriously. As Maria's hearing slowly returned, she became aware of a new sound that made her blood freeze. The sound of dozens of voices shouting in Pashto, getting closer. The enemy was moving in for the final assault. They had waited long enough for the mortars to do their work. Now they were coming to finish off whatever was left. Through the ringing in her ears, Maria could make out individual words being shouted back and forth between enemy positions. She didn't speak much Pashto, but she had heard enough battlefield chatter to understand the basics. They were coordinating a final assault from multiple directions. In less than 5 minutes, the remnants of the SEAL team would be overrun by overwhelming numbers. That's when Maria Rodriguez, communications specialist from Colorado, made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She checked her rifle, counted her remaining ammunition, and prepared to do something that no amount of training had prepared her for. She was going to save her team or die trying. The only question was whether she would live long enough to find out which one it would be. Maria grabbed every smoke grenade she could find from the team's scattered equipment. For grenades, not much, but it would have to be enough. She also collected 2 fragmentation grenades and checked her ammunition one final time. 43 rounds in her rifle, 2 spare magazines with 30 rounds each. 103 bullets to hold off an entire company of enemy fighters. She looked at Chun, who was the most alert of the remaining team members. Give me 60 seconds after the smoke goes up, then move everyone toward that wadi. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't wait for me. Get them to safety. Chin's eyes went wide as he realized what she was planning. Rodriguez, you can't take on 40 fighters by yourself. That's not a diversion, that's suicide. Maybe, Maria replied, pulling the pins on 2 smoke grenades simultaneously. But it's the only chance any of us have. She hurled the grenades in opposite directions, creating a wall of thick gray smoke between their position and the advancing enemy. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her rifle and sprinted toward the ridge line where the majority of enemy fighters were positioned. It went against every instinct she had developed in 3 tours of combat. You never ran toward the enemy, never exposed yourself voluntarily, never took on overwhelming odds alone. But sometimes survival meant doing the impossible. The smoke gave her perhaps 30 seconds of concealment as she crossed the open ground. She could hear confused shouting in Pashto as the enemy fighters lost sight of their targets. Some were calling for the assault to continue. Others were demanding to know where the smoke was coming from. In the chaos, Maria managed to reach the base of the ridge undetected. She began climbing, using the rocks and sparse vegetation for cover. Her plan was simple in concept, but nearly impossible in execution. Get behind the enemy positions, cause maximum chaos and confusion, and hold their attention long enough for her team to escape. If she could make them think they were being attacked by a larger force, they might pull back from their assault positions to deal with the new threat. 15 feet up the ridge, she found what she was looking for, a narrow shelf of rock that provided a clear field of fire over 3 enemy positions. She could see the fighters below her, focused on the smoke-covered area where they thought the American team was hiding. They had no idea death was about to rain down on them from above. Maria selected her first target carefully. A fighter carrying what looked like an RPG launcher crouched behind a boulder about 50 meters below her position. She controlled her breathing, lined up her sights, and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped instantly, his weapon clattering down the rocky slope. Before the other fighters could react, Maria had shifted to her second target. Another clean shot, another enemy fighter down. The element of surprise gave her perhaps 10 seconds of unopposed shooting before the survivors realized where the fire was coming from. She used those seconds well. 3 more precise shots, 3 more targets eliminated. But then, the mountain exploded into chaos as the remaining fighters turned their attention toward her position. Automatic weapons fire raked the rocks around her, forcing her to scramble for better cover. From her new position behind a larger boulder, Maria could hear the enemy fighters shouting to each other, trying to coordinate their response to this unexpected threat. Some were calling for flanking maneuvers. Others were demanding suppressing fire. The confusion was exactly what she had hoped for. Instead of focusing on the trapped SEAL team, they were now focused on her. She risked a quick look over the boulder and saw muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions, all aimed in her direction. Bullets whined off the rocks around her, sending chips of stone flying. But, more importantly, she could see movement in the valley below. Gray shapes moving through the dissipating smoke toward the wadi. Her team was moving. A new sound caught her attention, the distinctive whump of a mortar tube firing. They were adjusting fire to her position now, which meant she had maybe 30 seconds before high explosive rounds started raining down on her rocky perch. Time to move. Maria grabbed her remaining smoke grenades and fragmentation grenades, planning her next move. She needed to keep the enemy's attention while staying alive long enough for her team to reach safety. The ridge line offered multiple positions, but each move would expose her to enemy fire. It was a deadly game of chess where one mistake meant death. She pulled the pin on her third smoke grenade and hurled it down the slope, then immediately moved to a new position 40 meters along the ridge. The smoke bought her precious seconds of concealment as she repositioned. From her new vantage point, she could see more enemy fighters, including a machine gun crew that had set up to cover the main escape route. The machine gun was the real threat. Its sustained fire could cut down her escaping teammates before they reached the wadi. Maria made a decision that she knew was probably her last. She was going to take out that gun position, even if it meant exposing herself to concentrated fire from every other enemy position on the ridge. She lined up her shot carefully, waiting for the machine gunner to expose himself. There, a brief glimpse of his head and shoulder as he adjusted his position. Maria squeezed the trigger and watched through her scope as the man jerked backward. The machine gun went silent, but her muzzle flash had given away her position completely. Within seconds, every enemy weapon in the area was pouring fire onto her location. The volume was incredible, hundreds of rounds per minute striking the rocks around her, filling the air with deadly fragments and the deafening noise of ricochets. Maria pressed herself as flat as possible behind her boulder, feeling the rock shudder under the impact of multiple bullets. She could hear chunks of stone being blown away from her cover, making it smaller and less effective with each passing second. Soon she would have no protection at all. Through the incredible noise, she heard a sound that made her heart sink, the whistle of incoming mortar rounds, adjusted now for her exact position. She had perhaps 5 seconds before the area around her turned into a killing field of flying shrapnel and explosive force. But then, she heard something else, something that made her risk everything for one more look toward the valley. Voices calling in English, faint but unmistakable. Her team had reached the wadi and was calling for her to follow. They had made it to relative safety, but they weren't leaving without her. The mortar rounds impacted just as Maria made her decision. The explosions were close enough to fill her lungs with dust and debris, close enough to leave her ears ringing and her vision blurred. But they also created a moment of chaos, a brief window when the enemy fighters had to take cover from their own falling shrapnel. Maria used that window to do something that defied all logic and tactical doctrine. Instead of trying to escape, instead of running toward safety, she stood up in full view of 40 enemy fighters and opened fire with everything she had. She poured rounds into every enemy position she could see, not aiming for precision now, but for maximum chaos and confusion. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy fighters dove for cover, assuming they were under attack by a much larger force. Some began falling back from their forward positions, convinced that American reinforcements had arrived. Others started firing wildly in multiple directions, no longer sure where the threat was coming from. In the midst of this chaos, Maria heard Chin's voice calling to her from the wadi, 200 meters away, but clear enough to understand. "Rodriguez, move now. We've got you covered." She looked down at her rifle and realized she had fired her last round. The weapon was empty, and she was down to her final magazine. But the plan had worked. The enemy was in complete disarray, some falling back, others firing at shadows. Her team was safe in the wadi, and the escape route was temporarily clear. Maria sprinted down the ridge line, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind her, she could hear the enemy fighters shouting new orders, trying to re-establish coordination. It wouldn't take them long to figure out that they had been fooled by a single soldier with limited ammunition. She reached the valley floor just as the enemy began to reorganize their fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet as she ran the final 100 meters toward the wadi. Behind her, she could hear the sound of pursuit, enemy fighters scrambling down from their positions to chase down the American who had caused so much chaos. 50 meters from safety, Maria felt a bullet tug at her sleeve. 25 meters, and another round passed close enough to her head that she could hear it whistle. 10 meters, and then friendly hands were pulling her down into the shallow safety of the dry stream bed. She collapsed against the muddy bank of the wadi, gasping for breath and trying to process what had just happened. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. More importantly, her entire team was alive and moving toward the gap in the ridgeline that represented their only hope of escape. But even as Chin slapped her on the shoulder and called her crazy, Maria knew this was far from over. The enemy would reorganize quickly, and they would be angry. Very angry. What she had done would be seen as a humiliation, a defeat at the hands of a single American soldier. They would come after the escaping team with everything they had. The real test was just beginning. The wadi provided cover, but not safety. As the team moved along the narrow stream bed toward the gap in the ridgeline, Maria could hear the enemy regrouping behind them. Angry voices carried across the valley, and the sound of vehicles starting up echoed off the rocky walls. The Taliban commander had called for reinforcements, and they were coming fast. Morrison was conscious again, but barely mobile. Kim and Williams took turns supporting him as they stumbled along the uneven bottom of the stream bed. Jackson had recovered from his concussion enough to walk, but his movements were unsteady and his weapon hung loose in his grip. Martinez cradled his wounded arm against his chest, his face pale with blood loss and pain. Maria took point, leading the wounded team toward what she hoped was an escape route. The gap between the ridgelines looked promising from a distance, but she knew that enemy fighters could be moving to cut them off from the other side. Every step forward could be walking into another trap. Chin moved up beside her, his rifle ready despite the exhaustion written across his face. "How many rounds you got left?" he asked quietly. Maria checked her final magazine. 28. You. 15. Chin looked back at the rest of the team. Williams has maybe 10 rounds left. Jackson's weapon is completely jammed now. Martinez can barely hold his rifle with that arm wound. He paused, calculating their chances. We're running on empty. The sound of truck engines grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive noise of heavy machine guns being mounted on vehicles. Maria had heard that sound before. Technical vehicles, pickup trucks with crew-served weapons bolted in the back. Fast, mobile, and deadly. They would be able to move around the valley much faster than a team of wounded soldiers on foot. How far to the gap? Williams called from behind them, his voice strained from the effort of supporting Morrison. Maria studied the terrain ahead. The stream bed curved to the right, following the natural contours of the valley floor. From her current position, she estimated they were still 800 meters from the gap between the ridgelines. 800 meters of open country with minimal cover and no way to call for help. 10 minutes if we push hard, she replied. But we're going to have company soon. As if summoned by her words, the first technical vehicle appeared on the ridge line behind them. Even at this distance, Maria could see the heavy machine gun mounted in its bed and the figures clustered around it. The truck began moving along the ridge, paralleling their route, and looking for a position where it could bring effective fire to bear. More vehicles appeared, at least 4 trucks visible now, carrying what looked like 20 or 30 additional fighters. The enemy was moving to surround them again, but this time they would be ready for any tricks. This time they would finish the job. Maria made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of continuing toward the gap, she turned and began moving back toward the pursuing enemy. Rodriguez, what are you doing? Chin grabbed her arm. The exit is that way. They're moving faster than we are, Maria replied, checking her rifle. They'll cut us off before we reach the gap. Someone needs to slow them down. Chin's face went pale as he realized what she was suggesting. You can't take on 4 truckloads of fighters with 28 rounds. That's not slowing them down. That's getting yourself killed for nothing. Maria looked at the faces of her teammates, wounded, exhausted men who had already given everything they had. Morrison was barely conscious again, his face gray with blood loss. Kim was trying to hold a pressure bandage against his own shrapnel wound while treating the team leader. They were in no condition to fight a running battle against superior numbers. Get them to the gap, she said quietly. I'll buy you as much time as I can. Before Chin could stop her, Maria was moving back along the wadi toward the sound of approaching vehicles. She knew it was probably a suicide mission, but She also knew it was the only chance her team had. Someone had to make a stand, and she was the only one left who could do it. She found a position where the stream bed curved sharply, creating a natural choke point. High banks on both sides would force the enemy vehicles to approach along a predictable route. It wasn't much of an advantage, but it was better than trying to fight in open ground. Maria checked her equipment one final time. 28 rounds in her rifle, one fragmentation grenade, and a fighting knife that had belonged to her grandfather. Not much to stop a mechanized assault, but she had learned something important on that ridge. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for something nobody had tried yet. The first technical came around the bend in the stream bed faster than she expected. The driver was pushing hard, probably trying to catch up with the escaping Americans before they reached the gap. That urgency was about to cost him everything. Maria waited until the truck was completely committed to the narrow passage, then opened fire on the driver.